Hello, everybody. My name is Laura Lowe. I work at Hopelink. I'm the program manager for Find a Ride, which is a multi-phase, multi-year project that we've launched a trip planner, but that's just the beginning. And we're going to talk a little bit about phase two, and then in the next session, talk about phase one. So you're kind of getting the story in reverse, but it worked out for what we wanted to talk about. And this session is usually this working group that we have today with all of you here is usually just Anat, Sean, Thomas, and I. So quite a big change from having a small group discussion to trying to broaden this to more folks and make it both relevant and also a working group session. So thank you for any kind of different levels of conversations that are happening at the same time here. And I'm going to turn it over to Thomas.
I'm just introducing myself again, right? Okay, yeah. And I'm Thomas Gregg, data analyst with WashDOT, and I'll also be presenting here along with Laura and having a discussion. As Laura focuses on the Hopelink Find a Ride trip planner, I'll focus more on GTFS-Flex and other related data standards. And looking forward to the conversation. Please, as we present, interrupt us at any time. We have material that we're going to kind of lead through, but this is also, as Laura mentioned, normally a discussion. So, please feel free to interject and have a discussion as you see fit.
So if you're online, please adjust your name to include your agency or affiliation. And when you're speaking, make sure to introduce yourself each time you speak for folks in the room so they know who's speaking. And think about, while we're doing the session, how the recent adoption of GTFS-Flex data standard impacts your work. I dropped a link in the chat with an article about that, a blog post that we did yesterday. You can also go to the King County Mobility website and to our blog, and the first post on there is about that. And then throughout the day and in the session, what projects are you working on that others here should know about? This is really a space, a really rare, special, unique, beautiful space where a lot of us that interact online get to meet in person. And for those of you that are at home, hopefully we get to meet in person soon. So today, the agenda, we've done our introductions. We're going to talk about GTFS-Flex, it's making history. We're going to talk about Find a Ride's trip planner, and then what's next for GTFS-Flex and Find a Ride. Thomas is up first, and you go next.
Okay. I only have a few transitions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to both try to give a history of GTFS-Flex and kind of talk a little bit about how GTFS-Flex, which I will define very soon, came about. I'll talk about how it evolved. I'll talk about where it is today. I'll get into the technical specifics. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of the current Find a Ride trip planner and some of WashDOT's current activities, but I'll try to also mix in that historical context. So if GTFS-Flex is new to you and you have questions about it, this session is totally a good time to ask. So first, what is GTFS-Flex? Many of you already know what GTFS is, and if you don't, it is the General Transit Feed Specification. But don't remember that. It doesn't matter. It's GTFS, just like JPEG or PDF. We don't know what those stand for. Some of us do. Sorry, that's not an allowed discussion today. General Transit Feed Specification is a file standard, a file specification, a data specification that allows transit agencies to describe what used to be just their fixed route stops, schedules, and fares, and be able to transmit that through digital interfaces. So the most common way that GTFS data is used today is in Google Maps, Apple Maps, the Transit app, One Bus Away, all sorts of customer-facing trip planner applications. And generally speaking, any trip planner application that you've used for transit has been working with GTFS data that's published by transit agencies. So King County Metro, Sound Transit, every other transit agency in Washington state publishes a GTFS file. Those applications collect that GTFS direct from the agencies and then use that in order to convey those schedules through their applications. So GTFS-Flex is history. It no longer exists in a sense. And that is because just a few weeks ago, or a couple weeks ago, the GTFS specification governance process um, uh, 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 facilitated and adopted through a vote that what used to be called GTFS-Flex into the GTFS specification. So now GTFS does not only define fixed route transportation services, but GTFS actually also includes now demand responsive service elements. So that used to be a proposed extension to GTFS, which we called GTFS Flex, but GTFS Flex has now been officially adopted, as many extensions were before it, into GTFS. And GTFS Flex now part of GTFS. So GTFS Flex, what's now in GTFS, focuses, as I said, now on demand responsive services as opposed to fixed route services. So any transit service that brings you from point A to point B, but either has flexibility in the locations or the times that it will provide that service at. So a fixed route transportation service has set stops and set times. And demand response in this context means any transit service that provides flexibility in either the stop location or the time of stop. Both of those fall under demand responsive service that gets described in GTFS Flex, which is now GTFS. However, GTFS Flex, while it is very open-ended, and that obviously describes a lot of different potential transportation services, also only tells part of the rider's story, or really only captures part of the information that a rider needs for their trip experience. And we'll talk about more of the specifications that are needed later on. But basically what that means is GTFS, for demand responsive services, helps you understand the core trip plan of what's my start location going to be, what's my end location going to be, and what's the time in which that trip will happen. It doesn't focus on the real-time information for demand responsive services. So an on-demand service, it won't tell you precisely when that trip is going to show up, but it will tell you when that trip can show up, when that trip can deliver you to a particular location. So GTFS Flex describes the possible demand responsive services that a rider has access to. And that's all encompassed within that one GTFS Flex file. GTFS Flex evolved over a long time. It's going to be hard to remember that GTFS Flex is now GTFS because it was GTFS Flex for a long, long, long time. The first proposal for GTFS Flex came only about 5 or 6 years after GTFS itself was created, back in, I think it was 2011, 2012, somewhere in that time frame. Brian Ferris, who was working at Google at the time, or still is working at Google, and a couple other individuals, Ross, who was working at Ross Peterson, was working as an independent consultant at the time, and various others put together a Google Doc that said, what if GTFS could also capture these other services that are left behind today? And that really was kind of the original impetus of GTFS-Flex, was the recognition that GTFS left many rider stories out, left many transportation services out. And these services were especially common in two contexts. One, in services that were in the US are commonly provided specifically for the purposes of serving communities, whether individual communities, whether it's people with disabilities, whether it's people over a certain age, whether it is people under a certain age, various services that are eligibility restricted in some sense. And second, services in more rural areas where demand responsive services are much more common. Well, where general public demand responsive services are more common, I should say. And after that initial proposal for GTFS-Flex back now more than a decade ago, that really just sat in a Google Doc as an idea for about 5 years until 2016, when I was actually out in my garden doing some weeding in the middle of the day, taking a break from work, and I got a call from Ross McDonald in Vermont saying, hey, there's this Mod Sandbox grant, and you've been ranting about this GTFS-Flex stuff for the last year I've been working with you. Is there a project that we could put together a proposal for? And I went inside back to my computer, said, the weeding can wait for later. Wrote a proposal to the FTA, and ultimately that turned into the Vermont Mod Sandbox project. That was the first project that incorporated GTFS-Flex into a trip planner, into Open Trip Planner version 1 that has since been reworked. Vermont led to more visibility for GTFS-Flex, more interest, and I'll say from there, while I will claim to have been in that garden at 1 p.m. when Ross called me that afternoon, from there, this is totally a community-driven initiative, and I have been amazed at the engagement and the interest from so many folk over the last 8 years since then. Because really, I think the story of the last 8 years is just about community interest and community recognition that there continues to be a need to represent these other transit stories. So I and many other folk kept getting asked questions about it. You started to see GTFS-Flex being represented in more and more academic papers and marketing materials. I read a proposal for a project yesterday written by a business that totally misrepresented what GTFS-Flex does and lied about it, using it as a buzzword. And I did not, I won't say how I treated that proposal. But that started to happen. There just started to be that buzz. There was an NCAT, the National Center for Applied Transit Technology, ran by the Community Transportation Association of America, published a GTFS-Flex white paper to describe what was possible through this data specification. Minnesota DOT picked up this specification for a project that has launched this year. Hopelink began its business planning process back in 2019 to think about. So there's been a variety of different folk involved in this project over the course of the last 8 years, and it's really been interesting to see that community interest continue to evolve. So GTFS-Flex started a long time ago. There's at various times been individuals who did certain things of importance, but I think the story here of GTFS-Flex is one of a lot of people continuing to show interest and desire to learn more and make it easier to access demand responsive service information. Where GTFS-Flex is today, as I mentioned, it's now history. As of just a couple of weeks ago, the global GTFS community held a vote. GTFS is governed by an anarchy. You may vote. You are an official representative and may vote on the GTFS specification. You show up, you plus one, you minus one. You have veto power over the GTFS specification. If you minus one something, we'll ask you questions. But you have that power. Anyone has that power. And when GTFS-Flex was brought to a vote, 18 people came and voted yes, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that was the largest vote on any GTFS specification extension that has ever happened. It's hard to drive people and drive interest, and not a lot of people vote in these things. It's usually 4 or 5 people from around the world making that decision. But 18 different organizations came together and called that, and no one voted against it. So it's now GTFS. Should probably move a little faster. Yeah, I'll move faster. So technically, what is GTFS-Flex? It is GTFS plus a few specific files that help us describe demand responsive services. Highlights are new fields in the stoptimes.txt file. In stoptimes.txt, we now have a start pickup window, stop pickup window, start drop off window, stop drop off window. These fields basically just, instead of specifying the exact time that a bus shows up at a stop, they describe a window within which a vehicle can go to a certain location. There's new tables, location group stops, and booking rules. These define groups of stops. If you have a service that basically has designated stops that it'll go to, but not in a designated order, a checkpoint service, this is sometimes called, you can describe that in location groups and location group stops. If you have booking rules about how long in advance of a trip you need to book a service, you can describe that in the booking rules file. Also super exciting, and this was actually the most controversial part of the GTFS-Flex adoption process, was the inclusion of a GeoJSON file inside the zip that describes the GTFS. Locations.geojson is used to describe the polygons and multi-polygons within which service can be provided geographically. So everything else in GTFS is a TXT. Now we're shoving that GeoJSON in there as well, which of course opened up some technical discussions in that universe of like, what does it mean to suddenly insert a different type of technical file in GTFS? When you get these slides later, you can go back and see that historical discussion and various kind of conversations that came along with it. You can see the vote itself. It's all at the pull request that I've linked to in this slide. And there's still, I'll say, bits of GTFS-Flex that have not been adopted. One in particular are fields called the mean duration factor, mean duration offset. These fields describe the relative speed of shared ride services. If you have to pick up and drop off 2 other people in your trip from your origin to your destination, then you're not going to get there as fast as a taxi service would get there. You're going to get there slower, and these fields help describe how much slower, but they're not adopted into GTFS yet. Yeah, question.
The booking rules reference object in the location.
So booking rules is referenced from trips.txt. So a trip has booking rules assigned to it, and the trip references various locations that it services. So they are tied together, but they're tied together via the trip. Oh.
Yeah. Limited, like, where one point has to be fixed, like a point of service.
Yes, totally. So one of the honestly, there was a lot of talk over the years of why are we mixing fixed route and demand responsive service? Often, like for the most typical demand responsive service, it's kind of inconvenient to shove that into the fixed route file. And you could do a much simpler file format that described paratransit and taxi services if you separated that out and did it by itself. But the advantage of combining that into one file is you can mix and match fixed route and demand responsive services in a variety of ways to accomplish that kind of end or many others. So deviated fixed services, where there's a sequence of stops, but also the ability to go off that route in between. In Vermont, I remember there's one service that's a fixed route along a rural highway, but then turns into a demand responsive service inside a small town center to kind of bring people to various stores within that town center before going back out, a shopper service. All of those things can describe, and you can kind of mix and match in any way. So I think I answered abstractly, but did that answer your question too? So wrapping up here, in Washington and in the US, just kind of an update of where Flex data is out. We have a somewhat ambitious, I put ambitious on this because I may not accomplish this. We may not accomplish this. Sorry if not. But we're going to try to have a statewide Flex file by the end of the year. We're going to try to describe every public transit agency in the state of Washington and their demand responsive services by the end of the year. We may make it. There's Flex data in many other states as well. Oregon has basically a statewide file, although currently it's not quite up to date. It was made a couple of years ago. Vermont has a statewide file. Minnesota, and I believe it's southeast Minnesota, south central Minnesota. There's about 10 Flex files that are all in an open trip planner and transit app based implementation there. Nebraska has a trip planner that has a number of Flex files. So this is actually quite common at this point, even though it was only recently adopted. And there's over 100 agencies in the US that have a Flex file. Doreen?
Just before, does the Flex file include information about the vehicle? Like, does it have wheelchair capacity or bike rack or like interior configuration compatible with like shopping carts? These are things people I think move on about.
Yeah, very good question from Doreen, asking about whether GTFS-Flex includes information about the vehicle, the capacities of that vehicle for carriage, for mobility devices, et cetera. And the answer is currently no, but when I come back here in a few minutes, I'll talk about exactly that as one of the specifications that we need in order to provide this information. Ryan?
How much progress has been made in trying to create statewide coverage of Flex data within like the new year or so?
Yeah. We're up to about, I want to say 30% of the state now, which is up from about 20% late last fall. But in that 10%, I think what has really happened that's been a big change, which is really important, is we've brought along a few agencies into the process of wanting to make this data themselves. Hopelink's trip planner that Laura will talk about, a lot of the data was made by a WashDoc contractor in collaboration with the agency, talking with the agency, and that's great. But what we really need long-term is for agency tech departments to be publishing this data themselves and owning it themselves. And we've made some good progress with that. We're talking more and more with King County Metro that has staff assigned to work on this file. We're having conversations with Whatcom, which is also working on making this file itself, as well as Kitsap Transit, which is working on making this file itself. So we have pulled along a number of agencies to start to really get invested, which I think is great for the long-term initiative. And time for one more question.
When you say statewide coverage, are you just looking at public transit agencies or general public, like stuff like that? What is?
Yeah, very good question of what statewide means in this context. Public transit services, so services operated by transit districts or other fixed route transit operating agencies regardless of whether it is eligibility restricted. So we are seeking to build paratransit files, even though we can't fully describe the eligibility restrictions at this time. Large nonprofits that operate as the primary service provider within their region. I'm thinking, for example, People for People in Central and Southern Washington is a good example of that type of organization. We're not including private taxi operators at this time. We're not including private medical, non-emergency medical transportation operators at this time. So public transits and larger nonprofits that are the primary service provider in their region is, I guess, the best answer I can give. Okay.
Just for the benefit of everyone, do you know the most recent vehicle miles traveled in Washington State that are not currently represented by GTFS, but will be GTFS-Flex? So as of 2019, that was 32% of vehicle miles traveled. I don't know about current data, but
that sounds about right based on like what I last looked at. I mean,
can you repeat what Matt said for the folks at home?
Yeah. So the question is sort of like out of the percent of vehicle miles traveled by transit agencies that weren't represented as of a couple of years ago, how much is represented now or is about to be based on new Flex publication? And I don't know the exact answer to that question, but King County Metro's paratransit is probably going to be the largest. I would guess off a but to be honest, like, yeah, I don't know the vehicle miles traveled kind of stats well enough to specify.
Good to know when you're producing this data and what impact it actually has. Great.
Yeah, totally. Yes. I'll be honest, like I often say about fixed route transit, I don't care about ridership. Like when I'm thinking about fixed route transit analytics, ridership is totally irrelevant to me because I think of ridership as something that is radically depressed in our current environment because we don't provide enough transit service. So no one rides, fewer people ride transit. So we have less transit available out there. If there is more transit, there would be more ridership. Similar in Flexland, like I think of the opportunity as visualizing every service, and then who knows where those vehicle miles traveled are going to be in future years once there's access to those services. That's kind of how I think about it, which is why it's not top of my mind, but I totally see your point.
But even just including in the digital record means that we now account for it.
Yeah.
And state DOTs are responsible for recording this, but they have no way of recording it right.
Correct. And one of my ulterior motives here is ultimately to link all of this up to NTD data, because we as regulators today, we don't have any way to tie the sort of like operational information that's in NTD to the service information that we don't have any way to machine readably describe until now. So we got to connect these together so we can do that. Okay. I'm so sorry, Laura.
It's okay.
So at the federal level, we've seen the federal government move to a position where they want fixed route data.
Yeah.
In GTFS.
Yeah.
From your perspective, is Washington State going to move in that direction to demand public transit authority generate the full spectrum in GTFS?
Trying to get me into trouble. Both bringing up FTA regulations and what Washington is going to regulate. Wow. Washington. Yes, thank you. Also, no. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So my boss, who's listening in, can no. So the question. was kind of, the FTA with its NTD reporting requirements that started up last year is now requiring fixed route GTFS to be published by transit agencies and reported by transit agencies. I will say, even though you didn't ask, they made the odd decision, which WashDOT commented on, to also require reporting about demand responsive services in a format where demand responsive service providers must provide an exhaustive list of all the municipalities within which they provide either partial or complete coverage of demand responsive services. And if you're a data analyst, you are so angry right now. I am, anyways. Washington is a stakeholder-driven, partner-driven, bottom-up state. We don't tell agencies what to do, and I'm not going to tell agencies what to do. I can't and won't. What we want to do is we want to align on how we're best going to be able to serve riders statewide. We want to build a consensus amongst transit agencies of what we can do to promote that, and then provide collaborative resources in order to help people move along. So, no, we're not planning on moving into the direction of requiring this per se. But if a transit agency isn't publishing this data, they're going to be offered help quite often. Okay. You can always I actually start conversations that way. I was talking with a transit agency recently, and I was like, none of this is a requirement. You can tell me to go away. They did not, thankfully. Okay, so I'll just quickly go through this. Other WashDOT kind of near-term plans for using this Flex data. We're working with the Oregon Department of Transportation on a data warehouse that's going to be incorporating GTFS and GTFS-Flex data in order to help us kind of analyze this data en masse. I am working with a King County Metro and also a PSRC staff member on my advisory group for that. We're going to be mapping demand responsive services, so get ready later this year for the draft publication of maps of demand responsive service, although that is much more complex an exercise than it sounds. We hope to start prototyping accessibility analyses with this demand responsive service. We're working with an accessibility analysis software provider in order to incorporate Flex data and actually measure the access provided by demand responsive service. And we're taking requests. So if there's something that you want to hear about or see us do with Flex data, please email me, thomas.craig@washdot.wa.gov or gtfs@washdot.wa.gov. Let me know. More than happy to work on it with you. So with that, let's do a transition and let's have Laura speak to the Find a Ride program.
Okay, so Find a Ride is a project, multi-phase, multi-year project. We're just at phase 1A, so beginning of the beginning. Started back in 2018 with a planning grant, Transit Planning for All grant, and evaluated how do older adults, people with disabilities, and caregivers find and secure transportation. And this was done with many people that are in the room right now, online as well. You all were here before I even started this project, so you could be up here talking about that. Basically, with the inclusive planning philosophy at Hopelink, which is a large nonprofit located in East King County in Washington that focuses on moving people to exit poverty through workforce development and food programs and lots of other amazing things, digital equity, and I could go on about how great Hopelink is, but really focusing on this question: how do older adults, people with disabilities, and caregivers find and secure transportation? And when today's theme is, the trips not taken, that's definitely a focus of the team that I work on, the mobility team. There's about 14 of us now and growing on the mobility team at Hopelink, and we really work to address the gaps and educate folks and do advocacy as well. So for this project, it was led through that King County Mobility Coalition with Snohomish and Pierce partners from the beginning. And recently, we have support from King County Metro, Sound Transit, lots of other funding partners, WashDOT, Consolidated Grant, more. I don't have the funding information on here, but I do. The next slide. So during the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, there was kind of a one call, one click system that was stood up to help people get rides. And that was coordinated with many, many different agencies and organizations. They kind of showed us that we at Hopelink could kind of set this up very informally, in an Excel spreadsheet type thing. We've gotten funding for this phase 1 through 2027 from the Washington State Department of Transportation's Consolidated Grant with match support from Hopelink, King County Metro, Sound Transit, and more. The multi-phase roadmap includes something really exciting and tied to today's event, which is integration with Access Map. We'd love to get there sooner than later to help folks to be able to plan their complete trip. I know people had trouble getting here today as well, so we need that sooner than later. Also, things on our roadmap that we're not going to discuss today as much: trip brokering, payment and billing. We are going to focus on phase 2 today, which is the next phase, which is intake, eligibility determination, and enrollment verification. And right now, you can go to findaride.org and see our trip planner in action. At the session at 11 o'clock, that's the Regional Open Trip Planner Working Group, and we're going to discuss some very specific examples about GTFS-Flex data creation and data maintenance. So I did not touch on that in this presentation, so stay tuned for that. And you'll learn all about a specific data challenge we've nicknamed Snake Donuts. So Snake Donuts, the other day in a meeting, Thomas created this wonderful image of snake donuts. So this person, the image, I'm going to describe it. There's 3 or 4 or 5 green snakes. There's a pink, delicious looking kind of Homer Simpson's donut in the middle, and a hand looking up a trip plan that also has like a donut on some sort of map. And then there's coffee as well. So stay tuned for Snake Donuts in the next session. So I really want to focus today on transportation services, like who's in our system, the fact that we have this eligibility overlay, and then phase 2 and what that means for the GTFS. No longer GTFS-Flex, but the GTFS next steps as a community, more things that we need to make this trip planner actually work for community members. Because at the end of the day, that's who Hopelink is accountable to. That's who's on my advisory committee. That's who's in the room right now. Those are the folks that are like my real boss. So today's discussion focuses on how does Find a Ride's eligibility overlay and customize a user profile complete the story of specialized transportation. So you heard the start of the story with what Thomas said, is that we've started to be able to tell the story of these different services, but there's some pieces that are missing, and those are the pieces that are the most important, which is that the customized user profile and what it needs to be able to do so that people can be matched with the rides that they need. So for phase 2, we've applied for a grant. We'll find out at the end of August or September. It's an FTA grant for phase 2 for the intake, eligibility determination, and enrollment verification phase. We'll be reaching back out to all of you in this room and online for support when we get that funding. Right now, in terms of who's in our system, we've got American Cancer Society, Sound Generation, Snoqualmie Valley Transportation, North Shore Senior Center, Beyond the Borders, Hopelink NEMT, Volunteer Services, King County, as well as South Sound one, Muckleshoot Transportation, Metroflex, Everett Transit, Snow Goose Transit, Amish Senior Services, Zip Alderwood Shuttle, Pierce Rudder, fixed routes from all the major transit agencies, including ones outside of the 3-county region that we're focused on. Solid Ground Circulator, Eastside Friends of Seniors. There's other logos that aren't on here. The streetcar, monorail, ferries, Snoqualmie Valley Transportation. I think I said them already. But yeah, almost too many to name. So this is awesome. this isn't even all the services. There's still services that aren't in here. And I won't name them by name and call out anyone in the room, but there's some really important services that aren't in there yet. Matthew just said it's him. Yeah. So we're working really hard. It's been the entire time I've had my job. People have been working to tell the story of Metro Access. There's a student in the room that contributed to that and others, but it's really difficult to tell these stories of these transportation services. What is our timeline of our project? So software development happened, before I started, but what I've done so far is community testing. We did our soft launch in winter where people could finally get to the site at findaride.org/trip planner. We are going to be focused on a one-call task force, which means really the phone support piece. We know that people that take specialized transportation with eligibilities need that phone support, and really making sure that folks that provide phone support across the 3-county region, starting with King County, we call them like navigators, assisters, customer service. There's a lot of different names for the types of people that do that, are going to be providing that one-call support. So the project is called a one-call, one-click project. We have our one-click front end designed by Cambridge Systematics, supported with Arcadis IBI and OpenTrip Planner. On the back end, meet with those folks every week. They're in the room right now. Shout out to them. But the one-call piece is the piece that really speaks to what the community needs. And what the community needs is that person that will kind of help them with their complete trip. And a lot of people that call us right now at our transportation resources line are in crisis. They've been stranded in the past, or they're stranded right now. There's a lot of things around like isolation and frustration that the person that answers the phone right now is encountering. And so, again, with the theme of this event today, really focusing on the folks that are being failed by our current systems and really honoring the urgency that is demanded when we're dealing with folks that have spent, maybe their entire lives feeling like being told that they have to wait for a ride, wait for funding, wait for them to be the focus. So really focusing on partnership marketing with King County and his sisters to kind of like build momentum for this, and not overwhelm the system. That is a new system. We have Google Translate. As you all know, Google Translate language accessibility is questionable. We have some great partners with Metro that will help with language accessibility and translations, but working with community in an iterative inclusive planning process on language accessibility and improving that. And then phase 2 in fall, which is what we're going to talk about today. So we have our eligibility overlay and customizable user profile. That's a good start. It's a really good start. And that's our one click from Cambridge Systematics. And it's starting to tell that complete story of specialized transportation. It's starting to be able to give that matchmaking for somebody who's looking for a ride. Am I over 65? Do I need door-to-door support? Am I a veteran? Those kinds of matchmaking. Sometimes I call it like an Angie's List model more than like, what folks think of when they think of a trip planner, like a Google Maps type trip planner. And then, but this is just the beginning. And that GTFS-Flex that was just adopted into the GTFS standard, it doesn't have eligibilities yet. And so right now, to be able to tell the full story of these services, you do need that kind of front end overlay to tell the full story. It'd be great if it could all be in a single source of truth in the data. So this is what the eligibility profile looks. It's a screen that says customize your travel profile. And then the person goes down and kind of checks off different things. They can enter in their age 66. They can say if they're limited low income, and they can say their accommodations that they require. And right now, this information is being pretty much entered manually. So again, if it was done, if it was in the data, then it would save a lot of work. So this is a big long text that I'm not going to read. That was our project roadmap, phase 2 grant application that you can read later when you get the slides. but it basically says that we're going to build on the work we're doing, and we need some databases. I'm going to show you an image in a second that talks about what we need. So I just included this here so you would have what is phase 2. But this shows at the top, we're going to have, right now we have the Open Trip Planner from Arcadis, IBI, and then the Cambridge Systematics interface that folks see as like the front end. But there's a ton of stuff happening behind the scenes that we'll talk about in the next session with the Open Trip Planner work. And then what we need to build in phase 2 is some intake management systems and a user profile database to hold all of that eligibility information. So right now we have that initial kind of eligibility screening process, but we want to go much, much, much deeper so that we can have kind of pre-verification for folks. So if you qualify for one service, you qualify for these 6 others, so that folks don't have to keep going again and again and again to like 6 or 7 or 8 websites just to go visit their grandkid or get their hair cut or whatever, because a lot of these services have some pretty strict restrictions around like medical appointment only or workforce only. And so helping people know when they want to take a joyful trip, can they get a ride somewhere? Is there transportation for them? And oftentimes we know the answer is not really. So we have to build these intake. I got a little laughing from the audience because they know that this is true. So we have to build these big kind of data management systems in the next phase so that we can make the eligibility profile really, really, really give that really good match. So if you think of this as a matchmaking service, that's kind of a good way to think about what we're doing here.
Questions or
you can get into the weeds. Let me just finish if you can, or if you want to say it now, and then we can go into it when we get into the discussion at the end. Yeah, sure.
For the 65, why don't you put like birth year? Because that's a point in time.
So Jeff is asking why we don't have birth year in the system. I think when we initially designed it, there were some concerns at where we were in understanding private health information and needing more time to explore that. So I think that's a lot of the user profile now isn't asking so much information that it's delving into that private health information concerns. So this is a slide with the project vendors: Cambridge Systematics, Arcadis IBI Group, Trillium, Optibus. Other project vendors we work with are Anthrotech, and they've done 2 accessibility audits as well as Full Path Technology. Kevin Chambers, we work very closely with. Some of our funding partners: Metro Sound Transit, WashDOT, from the Climate Commitment Act funding, working with Disability Empowerment Center. In the past, we had funding from Aging Disability Services, Hopelink, and in the future for phase 2, we've got some really fantastic match partners for phase 2 funding that step forward for that next phase. So this is my contact information. You can go to finderide.org/trip planner. Please give us feedback. We don't know. I don't know everything. We don't know everything. We don't know what we don't know. And please reach out anytime. I'm a very approachable. Love to get out of my home or out of the office and meet up. And now we're going to talk about what this project phase 2 means. And in the next section, I'll go in deeper into the history of Find a Ride and more stuff. So this is you're only getting kind of part 2, and then you'll get part 1.
Okay. So this is Thomas Craig again, and I'm going to continue speaking a little bit more about GTFS-Flex, but from the perspective of what GTFS-Flex does not contain and does not offer, but is really needed to support the types of experiences, the rider stories, the user stories that aren't really approachable today within any trip planner. So, really one of the many things we need is more data specifications. We need data specifications that describe experiences and capacities that are not described today, but could be described in regular fashions that can be machine readable. And not all of those needs are fully identified yet, I don't think. But many of them are, and have been for years, and have been things that have been explored, trialed, maybe documented in a draft specification, similar to how GTFS-Flex was back more than a decade ago, but not yet enacted. And so I'll cover 4 of those kind of standards yet to be defined that would be useful in phase 2 of the Find a Ride trip planner, and will also be useful in a variety of other trip planners, but also just other applications that aren't trip planners around the world. The first is eligibility restrictions. Many types of transportation services have various types of eligibility restrictions, as Laura was just speaking to. Sometimes those are about age. Sometimes those are about disability or ability to ride fixed route transit. Sometimes those are about purpose of trip, whether the trip is for medical purposes or work purposes, etc. And those are things that, if you're looking for the best trip for you right then, you don't want to be offered 20 services, 17 of which you are not allowed to use for that trip. You want to be offered just the 3 services that are applicable for that trip. And we can't do that unless we understand both what those restrictions are and also some of the user traits that or user intentions that align with those eligibility restrictions. There's private information here, so this has to be done very thoughtfully. It's also just very difficult to standardize this information. There are so many different eligibility restrictions at different services. There, just one particular example, like an eligibility restriction, may be for participation in a particular state health program, right? And so that's an eligibility restriction that only matters within that state. And we have how many, states or provinces or other sorts of municipalities globally that might have such eligibility restrictions? I mean, thousands, right? So finding a way to describe that in a standard fashion that works both for a U.S. state, a Canadian province, a municipal segment of a government in Asia or Africa or Europe or wherever. Like, we need to be talking about both the global and the local at once, which is very difficult. In addition to eligibility restrictions, there's also what I'll call vehicle capacities. And this is to Doreen's question earlier. And it's a whole lot of different things. It sometimes seems to overlap in certain ways with the eligibility restriction discussion, and definitely is related to the user as well, and information about the user and the devices or the intentions or the needs that user has. So it contains personal information. But this is questions about how big is the space that is available for a mobility device? Which direction is that space oriented? Some riders may prefer a forward-facing seat to a backward-facing seat, and some vehicles may only have a backward-facing seat option. What weight is that mobility device allowed to be in order to use a vehicle lift? Baggage. If it's a shopping trip, are you allowed 5 grocery bags? Are you only allowed 2 grocery bags? Is there actually a place for you to put those grocery bags, or are you going to be forced to try to put them in between your knees in your single seat? These are all questions about the vehicle capacity that really inform a user whether that service is actually going to be useful for them. Go for it. Mm-hmm.
Give more information about the vehicle itself.
Mhm.
because I can tell you that when I've taken on-demand rides, share services, you don't always know that much about the vehicle or and
Right.
like a lot of times I can't even get into the vehicle because it's
I'm going to repeat the question.
Yep.
So the question was, or the comment was that there's a lot, even more factors to be considered than are on the slide or that Thomas is mentioning around, like how high it is to step into or out of the vehicle, and other information about that all of a sudden the ride's there. You booked it 6 months in advance. It actually showed up and didn't get canceled on you, and then you actually can't get in and out of the vehicle, and like how that just really it's another ride not taken in that moment, and a lot of just harm that's being done to the community in that moment.
Yep. Really good point. And I think implicit, but maybe also another thing, like identifying the right vehicle as it shows up, like knowing what type of vehicle you're looking for, those types of questions as well. So much information that needs to be conveyed. A third type is basically real-time booking and updates. So information about exactly when that service is going to show up. GTFS-Flex, as I mentioned earlier, tells you the window within which it can show up. Okay, well, I booked my trip. Now I want to be actually at the curb when it shows up, and I don't want to stand at the curb for 30 minutes or 60 minutes before it does. So now give me a notification, give me an update, let me know the exact arrival time. Let me know whether I'm going to make my medical appointment at 11 a.m. or whether suddenly I'm going to be late and need to call the doctor's office to warn them or whatever it is. But this real-time booking, I'll say, is not just about the customer information. There's also the need for that real-time exchange back on the operator's side, kind of from the brokerage perspective, thinking about how do I, as the operator of these services, assign vehicles to particular trips, provide particular services. That's also part of this real-time picture. Doreen?
And it does cover, so locations will have a lot of specificity about where people can be dropped off, or where people need to be dropped off, or a certain paratransit service likes to drop people across the street, not tell you they have to cross the street, and it has to do with one of the streets
Right.
and in a certain large concert venue, the taxi and seat pickup place is in a different place from the front venue. So,
Right.
a bunch of things like that.
Yeah.
I'm just going to repeat. Dorian's talking about other information that needs to be included, and how there's a lot of quirks in the system that have to do with like road conditions or direction of travel, or this happens a lot with big hospitals. Like maybe the address that's in the system is one side of Harborview, but really they prefer that you get dropped off over here. So if you just use, you know, location information, you might get the wrong one, and just all of those little things that people learn. But again, the experts of the system and designing the system, and people that need to be in the room and are in the room today, thankfully, when we're making data specifications, are the travelers that are impacted.
Yeah, and kind of, I'll answer. Some of that could be described in GTFS-Flex today. Like, for example, you could disallow drop-offs within certain areas and indicate that the drop-off is going to be at a particular stop location. Like you could describe some of that, but definitely not all of that. And I think part of the answer will eventually be within the GTFS Flex ecosystem. But part of the answer is also going to be in the pedestrian data ecosystem, in the future when we have really better information about facilities and on-premises walkways and entrances and that sort of stuff. Like some of that may exist outside the GTFS ecosystem, but still be critical to trip time.
For real-time booking, is there also movement towards real-time wait times, service availability, information you need kind of before you book the trip.
Yeah. So the question is around real-time availability, like the wait time when you're booking a trip. And a lot of that, yes, has been penciled out and definitely is there. There's active so there are quote unquote GTFS-Flex real-time equivalent standards in use in other parts of the world. One is the SUTI specification that is used primarily in Sweden, I believe it is. There's the TOMP API, which is a little bit more engaged also in payments and booking around payments, that is used primarily in the Netherlands, I believe it is. So Europe is a little bit ahead of us on this. But that like real-time communication and instantaneously communicating wait time and the updates around it is definitely a central part of that.
Follow
Yeah.
up is if there's kind of a connection between both fare eligibility and eligibility restriction, and then there's a connection between booking and fare payment.
Mhm.
And there's other work being done.
Yeah.
In the other GTFS world.
Yeah.
I'm a lot of smiling and laughing in the room because right now Finder doesn't have fares, but we want it to, but that's a whole other session that we could do another time.
Yeah, I'll say that's a very complicated question to ask, answer. And like for example, in GTFS Flex adoption, the question came up like, oh, you're making this new location groups files that describes groups of stops and a locations.geojson that describes areas. Well, GTFS fares v2, which is a recent change to the GTFS specification fares model, also has, I believe it's a file called stop areas. And there's another way to group stops as well. And we asked like, this is the same thing. We're talking about zone. Should we just put these all together? And ultimately, the answer we came to was no in this case, that there are differences in how these are being described and the use cases where it didn't make sense to leverage those same files. It made more sense to separate the use cases. But that's going to be a conversation that we have to revisit time and time again, and even more so as we get into eligibilities where so yeah, that's all I'll say now because it's definitely a complicated question. One last thing on the last slide, I'll just say, and then this will be the last thing I mention. There's also just a need to think beyond the trip plan. Like historically, GTFS has been a data standard for trip planners, which a trip planner in an abstract sense is about I'm a potential rider. I'm going to give you an origin, a destination, a time, and maybe some other parameters about that single trip. And you, the trip planner, are going to deliver back to me a service that brings me from the origin to the destination. But mobility is way more complex than just I need to go from point A to point B at X time. Mobility is about stringing trips together. It is about communing with other people, connecting with other people in social experiences. It's about flexibility. It's about being able to adjust your experience as you go. And so I think really what we need to start thinking about over the next 10 years is step a little bit back from that concept of trip planning itself and think about what, I'll give credit to the USDOT ITS JPO and their concept here of the complete trip, of thinking about the entire mobility experience, but even beyond the complete trip into kind of the complete mobility experience of planning, of thinking about how to move forward. We need to kind of start to think beyond the trip plan a little bit and think about the data structures that we need to describe more holistic mobility experiences. And I honestly don't know what that looks like today. I don't think any of us really do, but it's something that, if we don't understand that in the next 10 to 15 years, it'll be because we failed. So we need to start thinking about that more and more. And with that,
we are all heading to Zillow to the fourth floor, and you'll hear more from me about Finder right up there. And please find me in between sessions and at lunch. Laura Lowe with Hopelink, and that was Thomas Craig with WashDOT. And we're all moving to another location to hear about Open Trip Planner.